So thank you very much, Federico. And first, I would like to congratulate you for the creation of your Rebuild Jean Monnet Center of Excellence. I'm very grateful for your invitation to chair this panel. Although at first, I must say that I was a bit surprised as I am not an NGEU or budget expert. But once I had a look at the full program, I understood the genius of his programming and of your programming and research agenda, grouping together people with different backgrounds and perspectives to get a 360 virtual tour of NGEU. I must say that, Federico, you're a member of the Scientific Committee of the European Journal, of which I'm the editor-in-chief, and your new endeavor, the Rebuild Center, shows how much we share in terms of diagnosis on European integration and the need to renew its study through a post-critical approach which aims to tackle contemporary challenges and potentially find solutions to them. In terms also of methodology, now is not the time anymore to work in silos, and interdisciplinarity, obviously without methodological syncretism, is key to understand what NGEU and European integration are about and to define the way forward. Lastly, in a more and more polarized world, it is also important to foster dialogue among academics, members of EU and national institutions, practitioners, and civil society. All this, Federico, I think you've done brilliantly with this launch event, and I cannot wait to read the working papers that will come out of the Rebuild initiative. For all these reasons, I'm very honored to chair this panel dedicated to NGEU governance systems. In this regard, although we hear a lot about what the NGEU will be funding and how it will be funded, which will be topics addressed in tomorrow's sessions, the NGEU governance system is no less fundamental. And why is this so? We are used to refer to NGEU by its acronym, but we should not forget what it stands for, the Next Generation EU. In this sense, it goes beyond a mere recovery plan. It sets the path to our common future. The pandemic has shown us that the EU is at a crossroads and the world is fast changing. How well will we be able to adapt to tackle new challenges will determine the future of the European Union. And NGEU, which to be honest, we would all have thought unthinkable before the pandemic, is here to give us the means to make of European integration what it was meant to be, a collective effort to ensure peace and address challenges we would not be able to tackle successfully on our own. This relates directly to what NGEU will be funding. A strong emphasis is put on the twin green and digital transitions. To give some concrete examples, from the green side, today in France, in February, it is 16 degrees, which is unusually hot for the season. From the digital side, the UN negotiations on a ban on lethal autonomous weapons recently failed due to the opposition of the US and Russia. Russia and China have also announced a digital alliance, and this is without mentioning some weird drones that have appeared in the Syrian sky and which might appear again in Ukraine. In the meantime, Facebook, aka Meta, is working on an alternate reality called Metaverse, and under the current circumstances, one could wonder whether it would not be better to live in a parallel universe, except that the Meta one aims to influence the behavior of individuals reduced to consumers interacting with AI machines disguised as humans. So this raises questions regarding human dignity and fundamental rights. So it is far from anecdotal that the NGEU focuses on the twin green and digital transitions, which will only be transitions and not revolutions if we manage to get a hold of them in line with our fundamental values and principles, and if NGEU is part of the solutions we need to put into place for the EU to find and keep its place in the new geopolitical order that is looming ahead of us. I believe this relates directly to issues of strategic autonomy and European sovereignty addressed by Lord Clément-Vils in the previous session. But in his introductory speech today, Pascal Donoghue, the Eurogroup President and Irish Minister of Finance, quoted Jean Monnet. "Nothing is possible without men, but nothing lasts without institutions." So the governance of NGEU is also of vital importance. Put into context, how does it inscribe itself in the already existing governance framework and relate to other existing mechanisms? Does it signal a constitutional momentum for the EU? These are key questions to address and reflect upon in order to make sense of NGEU in the bigger picture, that is European integration, and in order to make sense of European integration itself. So to discuss this key topic and address these questions, we will benefit from the light of our expert panelists today, whom I will introduce briefly in order of appearance. Amy Verdun is Professor of Political Science and the founding director of the European Studies program at the University of Victoria, and she has extensively published on the EU governance system and European integration. Her presentation today will tackle NGEU, the European semester, and structural reforms. Michael Breen is Associate Professor at the DCU School of Law and Government, and one of his main research interests lies in the political economy of corruption. He is co-director of DCU's Anti-Corruption Research Center and an external associate of the Center for the Study of Globalization and Regionalization at the University of Warwick. He is also a member of Transparency International's Expert Advisory Network, and his presentation today will focus on avoiding corruption. Richard Crowe is Head of Unit for Institutional and Budgetary Law at the Legal Service of the European Parliament. And he's also a visiting professor in various institutions, and he will address the issue of NGEU and democratic control. I must say that he recently published an article in the ELG on an EU budget of states and citizens, which some people today might find interesting to read in this context. And Julio Baquero Cruz is a member of the legal service of the European Commission, working in the team tackling Eurozone and economic issues. He's been professors in various institutions and of course at the ULB. He is also a member of the ELG Scientific Committee. And before we start, I would like to remind the audience that do not hesitate to raise your hand, your virtual hand, and we will take your questions. So, Amy, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the invitation and congratulations to Federico and his team for a wonderful new center that will help us learn a lot about the past, but also the present and the future. So I was asked to talk about European semester and structural reforms, which draws on some of the work I've recently completed with Bart van Herke, but also a special issue of JCMS, the Journal of Common Market Studies, where also Federico Fabrini has a chapter in, or paper in, I should say. So I've been asked to speak about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. I'll try to stay within that time limit. So if I go over, please, Madam Chair, ask me to wrap up. So what we have seen in response to the COVID-19 pandemic was the EU using the long-term budget as a way to deal with the question of what will happen next. In our previous sessions, we heard about this already in a little bit of detail, but not as much as I wanted to highlight, and also in the interest of the rest of the panel, we also said it's important to have a little bit of this background, even though we're all drawing on these insights, and we know the audience is very well informed. But in a sense, we had this new temporary support system that formally was established in February 2021 after the Council, the European Council meeting in the summer and the December decision to move forward in this direction. And so this and the Next Generation EU, as Madam Chair has also spoken to, provides the financial support, notably through a combination of grants and loans. And as our core organizer has also spoken to in the previous session, this is a major change compared to before. At this point, it is temporary, but of course, all eyes are on the question of what this means as we move ahead. So in my presentation, I'd like to also highlight a connection to the European semester. So many of you will be familiar with the European semester as a way to coordinate macroeconomic policy coordination. And as I was asked to talk about structural reforms, this idea of how we can entice member states to make changes when we don't actually have the authority to force. And so the European semester, interestingly, became part of the RRF. So what we've seen at the European Council meeting that I mentioned before was that it agrees to unprecedented support for the member states that needed to work through the difficulties related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And so what was one of the questions that Bart van Herk and myself in our paper in JCMS and some subsequent follow-up publications, what we wanted to understand was the way in which this new arrangement drew in some of the earlier principles that had been set out in the European semester. So we looked at the extent to which this new setup changed the power balance among key players, so financial and economic players versus social affairs players. So with EU institutional social players, we mean those that are responsible for social policy and that we have also seen play an active role in the European semester, like DG Employment, Social Affairs and Inclusion of the European Commission, the Employment, Social Policy, Health and Consumer Affairs, the EBSCO Council formation, the EU Employment and Social Protection Committees, and the SPC. So social stakeholders are the EU level and national social partners. These are representatives of worker and employer organizations, as well as civil society organizations. And the research we did, reported in these publications, draws on these extensive document analysis and 32 semi-structured high-level interviews that we conducted from October 2020 to November 2021. On average, these interviews were 1 hour and they were held with senior position members, people who are in various European Commission Directorate Generals, as well as European social partner organizations representing member states in various EU committees. So what we found very interesting was that the European semester, before it was basically incorporated into the RRF, had been an arrangement that would received a fair bit of criticism. It was by some seen as overly loose. It didn't have a lot of teeth. On the other hand, it was seen as something that was a bit firm, particularly if we think about the Stability and Growth Pact and the ability to impose sanctions on member states exceeding the budgetary deficit rules. So what we thought was interesting was that despite the negativity that some in the scholarly community had used about this, it did end up in the construction. And we think that part of this is because of the formative experience of the Euro crisis, the timing, needing something quite quickly, but also having some kind of conditionality for spending the grant money on the Recovery and Resilience Facility. You will recall that the so-called Frugal Four, a coalition of member states that were critical about just giving money away without any strings attached, didn't want there to be nothing for the EU. So in a sense, the European semester ended up being in that sweet spot. We called it the Goldilocks arrangement. So not too hard, not too soft, something to build on, hardening the European semester for more carrots, but also some sticks. So in terms of how the integration of the RRF and the European semester changes economic policy coordination, of course, right away from the outset, a lot of the semester vehicles were in a sense frozen. There were no winter packages, country reports were replaced by national evaluations, and there were no new country-specific recommendations in that period, right as the COVID-19 crisis had erupted in the form of the pandemic. Other semester tools have been transformed, and since this time, of course, since November and more recently, we've seen annual sustainable growth strategy becoming the guidance. So in terms of the integration of the RRF and the European semester, you could see in the slide how the two have become integrated to make it possible to use what had already been a cycle that worked out well for coordination, but as mentioned, a bit critical by observers about the effectiveness, but then integrating this tool into the new governance structure. So the remarkable part here is also that even though it was seen as something that didn't work so well during the run-up to the pandemic, the European Commission didn't want to reinvent the wheel and come up with effectively something similar, where you'd have to come up with an assessment of member states' performance on some structural reforms issues, and then having to reinvent something completely new. So the European semester was also conveniently already doing something like what it was needed in order to keep member states to account. Now, the strategic actors that had been a key partner in the European semester, in particular social players, in the first part of the pandemic, actually lost a place around the table. So in the early days, the member states went very executive. The Prime Minister's office, close to the Prime Minister, close to the executive members at the national level, and the normal consultation mechanisms were, in a sense, put to the side. And so in this initial month following the launch of the RRF, following the European Council of the summer, a lot of social players felt that they had lost access they had in the semester. And what we saw these semester players do, again, reported in our interviews, was they just kept at the ready in order to be in the position when maybe the more normalcy came back. And here we have a bit of a picture of the kinds of things that we could imagine. So social players being worried about not being able to participate, but also benefiting from the new online culture that made it possible for some social players to have more direct access to some of the lead individuals in the policymaking process. So as we move from 2020 to 2021, we see an increasingly re-emergence of the existing tools, and it is being used as an institutional template, and also the legitimacy in the legal base to do so. So the strategic actors then put themselves at the ready to be part of the negotiations. Again, the online meeting culture played a role, and also the member state governments realized that some of the actors that were needed to give the legitimacy to the new governance structures would be these social players. After all, the pandemic led to different responses in the various sectors, and some of the more socially precarious players are in need of more support and more voice around the table. There's a gender dimension, things like poverty and precariousness increased during the period of the pandemic. So wrapping up my conclusion and offering some points for discussion, the social affairs players' roles in the EU economic governance role could not necessarily be taken for granted. It was important for them to be getting back a place at the table, even though initially when the European Council decision was made and it had to be unfolded, they were not included. And over time, they regained their place at the table. There is, in general, a bit of an asymmetry between economic and social policies. I mentioned the Stability and Growth Pact being one that does have sanctions, whereas the social policies are often much more in the principle of open method of coordination, a little bit more soft. And the EU level actors were more informally included early on, but the domestic level actors were not included sufficiently in the run-up in the recent year and a half, when there were no consultations. And again, civil society organizations have also not seen their usual role in this first period of the pandemic. Yet the semester offers sort of path-dependent opportunities and resources for strategic agency to include groups of actors that needed to be part of this in order to also legitimize this new major package of spending package and the ability to have the EU have more carrots and sticks. We argue that the European semester may end up becoming more effective due to the choice to embed it in the RRF with this sort of soft Goldilocks modes of governance, having more carrots and sticks, and be taken much more seriously by member states and stakeholders. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for this presentation, which really shows the dynamics and the interaction between different institutions, players, but also in terms of whether they focus on economic or whether they come from the social trend, the social part. However, I would say, weirdly enough, there's one institution which is not mentioned enough, and maybe should the inclusion of the European semester in the RF as well lead to rethinking the governance of the European semester as well. Because, for example, I didn't hear a word about the European Parliament. So that was interesting. And since Julio here and Richard as well have worked quite extensively on the role of the Commission, the Member States, the Council, and the European Parliament, I would like to give them the floor, and Michael as well, in order to see whether they have some remarks to make or some questions. And of course, if some of the participants have questions, please ask them now to Amy, because she will have to leave us earlier. Thank you. Who would like to intervene? Yes, Richard?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Karine. Yeah, I think a very interesting presentation. And regarding the European Parliament, this is, of course, an old story. How does the European Parliament get into the game of the European semester? And in some ways, we see the same thing with the Recovery and Resilience Facility. It's very much based on dialogues, and we also have this, the parliamentary phase, what they call the parliamentary phase of the European semester, which is coming up in March fairly soon, which is based around what they call the European Parliamentary Week, which is when parliamentarians from the national parliaments and the European Parliament meet here together in Brussels and consider the various the state of the advancement of the procedure and the recommendations and so on, which some dismiss as a talking shop. I think some years it's worked better than others. Particularly during the crisis, it was quite useful because really you had people from parliamentarians from Greece and parliamentarians from Germany with very different interests and perspectives all together in the same room discussing the process. But in terms of hard influence, of course, that's not very much built into it. Back to you, Karine.
Julio or Michael, would you like to say a word? No? Do we have questions about this very topic of the inclusion of the European semester? Federico?
I might take advantage of having Amy here for still, I think, 6 minutes, as she promised. And I also want to thank her again for connecting so early in time in Canada, but also to make her participation worthwhile. I just wanted to ask her a question on something I know she has worked on for a long time, which is really the effectiveness of the European semester. I mean, Amy, you were running an entire Jean Monnet action program yourself on that, and I think one of the takeaways from your research is that the European semester had a lot of learning process for the participants, but it was lacking teeth. And I wanted to ask you to what extent you think actually now, ironically, Next Generation EU is going to make the European semester much more significant than it used to be. And if you agree with that, I'd be happy to have your views also on the sort of the absence of the conversation about this. I mean, I think particularly of my home state, Italy, there's a lot of excitement for the almost 200 billion euros of funds coming from Europe to Italy, but very little appreciation of how, in fact, that will make the European semester much more stringent, because all the priority action point that the Commission identified over the years now become a condition to continue accessing funding. So I'd be happy to have your views on that.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Shall I respond to the questions? Okay, so thanks for both these questions and also for an audience in listening to my presentation. So on the European Parliament, we had the privilege of speaking to a few people in the European Parliament about the whole design of the RRF and the consultation. And they gave us a mixed review on how they themselves saw the European Parliament having been influential. So on the one hand, they did put, for example, gender issues on the agenda more prominently than had been done prior to their intervention. On the other hand, they realized that the tools are weak and it's not as easy to kind of have a seat at the table as one might want to have. And just before the European Parliament Week, we'll do an outreach event on March the 10th, where we will have a few people speak to our special issue of the Journal Common Market Studies that is the result of the work that Federico was talking about. And so those of you who are interested in that, it's hosted by the Committee of the Regions, and it's from 2 to 4 European times, Central European time on March the 10th, the Thursday. So anybody who's interested, stay tuned and come to that if you wish. So on the question of does the European semester now have more teeth? So our research suggests that it may very well now have more teeth. In part, what we saw in the run-up from the end of the sovereign debt crisis until the start of the pandemic, the whole period of the semester was a sort of learning, benchmarking, speaking to one another, coming up with different arrangements, and to highlight which elements of member state policies could possibly be changed. And so structural reform is a very heavy word, and it's often not being attempted to use when it can be done in a softer way. To look at some of the best practices is a softer way to say the same thing. But in terms of country-specific recommendations that are in fact drawn up in consultation with member states, there is an agenda set and provided to member states as to where some of these changes may need to happen. And in the publications that we've done for our project, we've indicated some member states that have been more successful and less successful in some areas where we see more and less compliance, as we call it, with the recommendations, even though even the word compliance and implementation is an awkward set of words to use, because that's something, as the legal scholars would know, is typically used for implementation of directives, right? Are directives transposed? Are people doing the work in line with EU law? Whereas the European semester is not that kind of an instrument, right? These are recommendations, you can put them to the side and you're not violating anything within the European semester, with the exception of the Stability and Growth Pact. Now with the RRF, there is a bit more teeth, a bit more requirement. And so we'll be, in fact, it's an empirical question to what extent the EU will be able to use this tool successfully moving forward.
Thank you very much, Amy. Thank you also for pointing out the role or the lack of role, or the questions surrounding the role of civil society and social players, because indeed, if we don't manage to integrate those on which these measures will have an impact, or those who could benefit from these measures, it put into question the success and future of the NGEU, and also the success of European integration itself. So thank you very much for these points. Actually, it's also interesting the way you perceive the European semester as a possible and its possible added value, because actually the LG with the College of Europe organized last year a conference on the future of Europe. And in this framework, Olivier de Schutter mentioned as a key tool to fight against rule of law violation, the European semesters. Yeah. So it seems like from various corners and disciplines, we have a new interest, a renewed interest in the European semester and the role it could play to tackle the current challenge European integration is facing. So thank you very much, Amy. But regarding fundamental rights, transparency is also very important, and avoiding corruption is also very important. So now I will give the floor to Michael Breen. Michael, the floor is yours.
Very much. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the generous introduction. I'm very happy to be here, and it's an honor and a pleasure to talk to you all today alongside such distinguished speakers. Before I begin, I'd like to thank my DCU colleague, Federico Breen, and the team at the Brexit Institute for organizing this event. As you said, my talk today is about avoiding corruption. And this is a major challenge for any public spending program. And Next Generation EU is no different in this regard. But Next Generation EU is not a typical public spending program because of its international dimension. It's essentially a transfer of resources from an international organization to another country for the benefit of its population, if you step back at it and look at it like that way. So in one sense, you could think of it as foreign aid, and that's certainly not a perfect comparison, but like foreign aid, there's an element of conditionality, in this case, the EU's rule of law conditions. And what we know about foreign aid or international aid programs like this one is or like ones along these lines, is they're particularly vulnerable to corruption. According to the former United Nations Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, we lose about 30% of all development assistance or aid money to corruption. Now, that being said, Next Generation EU is not directed at developing countries. It's directed at already high-performing economies, so it's not really foreign aid in that sense. But if we were to lose 30% of the total sums involved of 806 billion euros, and that would be equivalent to approximately 270 billion euros, an amount that is much greater than the sum total of all foreign aid that's sent to all developing countries in any given year. Now, you might say that Europe has some of the cleanest countries in the world and that this is very unlikely to happen. But suppose we're to lose only 5% to corruption. That's still 25% of all of the foreign aid that we would send to developing countries. So I hope we will lose considerably less of these funds to corruption. And thankfully, Europe has many countries that perform very well on the international corruption rankings. But even so, we must remember that all countries and institutions are vulnerable to corruption. Even the cleanest countries in Europe, even in many of them, public officials have been convicted of embezzling millions of euros, and many businesses regularly report being solicited for bribes. So we mustn't be complacent about corruption. Corruption is unfortunately everywhere. So how might we avoid corruption then? Well, in modern democracies, we typically control corruption through parliamentary oversight, media scrutiny, transparency measures, and anti-corruption laws and policies. But even with good institutions, laws and policies, public officials and public representatives, they must act with integrity and be seen by others to act with integrity. Just the perception of corruption can change people's behavior. Public officials at all levels of government can rationalize corruption if they believe that this is simply how things are done in my country. Now, that's how we do it in modern democracies, of course. At the European Union level, we have the European semester framework, which has been described by the previous distinguished speaker. So this brings me back to the question of, how might we avoid corruption in next generation EU funds? We already have a good idea where there are significant weaknesses in the European Union in terms of anti-corruption standards. The European Commission conducts detailed monitoring of anti-corruption standards in Europe on a regular basis. And also we have the Group of States Against Corruption, GRECO, which monitors states' compliance with anti-corruption standards. So we know on a country-by-country basis where anti-corruption standards could be improved and how they might be improved in every member of the European Union. I think Next Generation EU could have ring-fenced more of its funds specifically to strengthen anti-corruption standards. I think this might have been a missed opportunity. There's some very welcome investment in the modernization of public administration and the delivery of better public services. That's a good element of this new facility. And the transparency elements in national plans are also to be welcomed. But I think we could have seen more meaningful engagement on raising anti-corruption standards in some of these plans. In countries, not just where the rule of law is at risk and failing, but in other countries where there are nonetheless gaps. So, while we have national plans as part of Next Generation EU that are designed to be consistent with relevant country-specific challenges and the priorities identified in the European semester, we could have more measures that would raise anti-corruption standards independently of this, and I think that would signal their importance and could potentially save billions of euros. And I think this is justified given just how much is at stake in terms of funding. Investment could be made in many different ways to facilitate the media scrutiny, to strengthen civil society and parliamentary oversight, to bring in more transparency measures and anti-corruption laws and policies across the EU. So let's think for a second about the elements of this program then that are focused specifically on corruption. And of course, this brings me to the issue of conditionality. And, that's a common feature of international aid programs across the world. And as all of you know, the EU's rule of conditionality mechanism has been very controversial. And the most recent EU Court of Justice decision will allow the European Commission to withhold funds from member states for rule of law violations. I think it's worth stepping back and thinking about conditionality for a minute. You know, what is it? When is it effective? And I would say there's rather mixed evidence on when and in what context conditionality is effective. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank use a lot of conditions in their programs. The literature is somewhat divided about whether these conditions are effective. Some people say that the conditions in their program are far too influential. And then there are others that say that the conditionality instrument is too blunt and it isn't effective over the long term, that it doesn't really engender deeper reforms in societies. So there's quite a lot of division. Of course, there are several different types. When we speak of conditionality, there are many different types of conditions, and conditionality agreements can vary considerably. There is a major distinction between ex post and ex ante conditions. So those conditions that are set during a relationship, and those conditions that are set beforehand. In an ex post political conditionality arrangement, democratic governance and respect for human rights are objectives, whereas in an ex ante conditionality arrangement, they represent a precondition. And as well as this, you can have numerical performance criteria and structural performance criteria. So the EU's rule of law conditionality is, I would say, a type of structural conditionality. And the IMF and the World Bank have used similar types of conditions before in terms of good governance, but nothing really at the same level as the EU's in terms of just the strength of the EU's rule of law conditions. Unfortunately, we don't have any data on the overall effectiveness of these IMF and World Bank good governance conditions. I think the EU's version is less focused on enticing states to actually reform and actually improve their governance. It's more focused on holding governments accountable for failing to meet EU standards. And I think we should think about both objectives, that we have one covered, but we don't necessarily need to dilute rule of law conditionality, but we need to think about it in terms of how do we increase the incentives to reform? How could we have greater ex post conditionality effectively? I'll just conclude by saying that, you know, Next Generation EU is a considerable achievement. It's to be very welcomed. And I also think, even more importantly, it's going to provide us with a template for EU policymakers when the next crisis happens. And responding to the next crisis, you know, we'll have to think about this again. And financial crises and other types of societal crises can be opportunities for changes and improvements. But sometimes this can lead us to lower our standards and overlook corruption in the name of expediency. Any future or even permanent EU fiscal instrument needs to seriously invest in raising anti-corruption standards and capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Michael, for your presentation. Indeed, it's quite refreshing somehow to get an international perspective. It's not often among EU specialists anymore that the EU is qualified as an international organization. So it allows us to get a comparative comparative view of what's going on as far as corruption is concerned, and an evaluation of the systems put into place. At the same time, I would say we suddenly realize that it's quite nice to be in the EU, which is somehow a sui generis organization as well, which means that suddenly we understand why Amy Verdun found that the European semester was a positive step, and the conditionality mechanism view from your perspective might actually be a positive step as well. But now, without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Richard, who might have also something to say about that, since he's going to deal with democratic control in the EU, and then to Julio.
Okay, thank you, Karine. Yes, in 10 minutes, I'm not going to go into the deep philosophical issues of what democratic control means, but I'll just talk about parliaments and the parliament's role in all of this. Mainly the European Parliament, and also I'll talk a bit about national parliaments. So first of all, I think it's important to recall that this could have all gone intergovernmental very easily. And back in spring of 2022, we had non-papers from the French government, for example, saying that a recovery plan can just be a special purpose vehicle formed by the governments. So it's a good thing. I think I remember a very stressful plenary session in April 2020 in Strasbourg for the president of the commission, where the late David Sassoli and many MEPs were telling her, you absolutely must propose something by the community method. And yeah, I think Julio and his colleagues in the Commission Legal Service were very busy coming up with creative options to create a recovery plan based on borrowing within the EU treaties. And then, of course, the second moment where things could have gone awry was in December 2020, when 2 member states threatened to block the recovery plan because of the conditionality regulation. And again, I think lawyers were very creatively thinking of what possibilities are there as a plan B or a plan C or a plan D. For example, could the recovery plan be created by enhanced cooperation? I think in the real world, probably at that point, the governments, if it was to be only a certain group of governments, would have found it easier to go intergovernmental, and especially doing it within enhanced cooperation, for example, would have involved a qualified majority voting legal basis. And clearly certain governments absolutely wanted to do this with a unanimity basis in the event using the own resources decision. So it's a good thing it was done within the community framework. This gives the European institutions their role, notably the European Parliament, also the European Court of Auditors, OLAF, the EPPO, etc. These are implemented as European budgetary funds, and so the institutions of control exercise their regular powers. Now, having said that, it is also a very, very particular construction, and it's creative, it's different to what's gone before. I think Luc van Middelaar talks about the Europe of rules and the Europe of events. And I think the systems of the Union for overseeing the implementation of the budget and for the use of funds are based on the Europe of rules. We have these 7-year plans, everything is programmed, it's all very systematic. We have procedures that are regular, that are used to doing things in a certain way for decades. And then along comes this recovery plan, which is a different model. It was negotiated, drawn up in a very short period, less than a year. And the systems of parliamentary control and parliamentary scrutiny and audit control, audit scrutiny, they're not particularly well adapted to this instrument. And in a way, we found ourselves, or the institutions found themselves, improvising. And the main document which was used to improvise was an interinstitutional agreement of the 16th of December 2020 on cooperation in budgetary matters, which was revised during the course of 2020, or the draft was revised to include special provisions on NGEU. And particularly there is an annex to that IIA with a part H on cooperation as regards the NGEU. And really I'll focus on 2 main strands of parliamentary oversight. One is the more purely budgetary aspect, which is how do we ensure oversight of the borrowing on the markets? And secondly, in that regard, how the external assigned revenue is budgetized or used in budgetary terms. And then the second limb is the recovery and resilience facility. So thinking first of the borrowing, it's not the first time the EU borrows, but in the past the borrowing was more for these back-to-back off-budget operations where the EU borrows and on-lends directly to a beneficiary member state, such as under the balance of payments facility. Here we're borrowing for grants, it's something new, and the own resources decision and the recovery instrument regulation essentially authorize the Commission to borrow a huge amount, hundreds of billions, 750 billion in 2018 prices, over a short period of time. So who's overseeing the borrow? Does the Commission then just have a carte blanche to manage the borrowing? Well, the IIA is the instrument which provides some basis for control of what the Commission is doing. And essentially the control takes the form of meetings where the Commission comes before the Council and the Parliament, representatives of the Parliament and the Council, and gives account and explains what it's doing, what its plans are, what its schedule of borrowing is, and how things are going. Now, they're fascinating meetings. I've had the privilege of attending some of them, and the Commission comes and explains how it's setting up a dealing room in Luxembourg, a very big dealing room. They're now borrowing on the scale of a large member state like Italy, at least for the period of a couple of years. Also there, of course, they needed expertise, and I think a lot of the staff are national experts from national treasuries coming now, putting on an EU hat and borrowing as EU officials. Every time these meetings take place, the Director General of DG Budge comes and says it's a great success because the latest transaction, it always seems to be that the latest bond issuance is the biggest supranational transaction ever. And this has been progressively going on for several months now. And in many ways, it is a success in the sense that this implies investors out there have confidence in the EU. And even more so, investors out there in the world, also that you see the Commissioner traveling to the Middle East and the Far East and wherever, they do believe, it seems, that the EU will still exist in 2058, the deadline for the final repayments, and will thereby celebrate its centenary, which I think we can all also hope that happens. Now, of course, it's easy nowadays to see this as a success in the sense that the money is coming in. This is the easy part. And I think this has been discussed earlier. Of course, the money will have to be repaid one day. And there, the dark clouds may roll in. And we already see a bit in December of last year, the Commission presented proposals for new own resources. And already, even here in the Parliament, we see some MEPs saying, well, if we have new money coming in, let's use it for current priorities. Let's use it for the climate transition. You know, the repayments can wait. So let's see, it is a potential danger. The money will have to be repaid, or else they find an alternative solution and come up with some plan for developing perpetual bonds and kind of pushing back the repayments to eternity. But anyway, the EU borrowing strategy, there is an own initiative report of the Parliament under preparation on that. So hopefully that will bring some more visibility to the topic. Then as regards the external assigned revenue, the proceeds of the borrowing, they're not own resources. Legally, they're not treated as own resources. They are external assigned revenue, which is money coming from the outside, assigned to specific expenditure items. Now, classically, external assigned revenue was used, for example, for the contributions of EFTA countries to EU programs in which they participate. So it's money coming from the outside, which might be assigned, in the case of an EFTA country, to, let's say, the Horizon Research Program in which they're participating. But once it is assigned within the budget, it is implemented in accordance with the EU budgetary rules. So where it deviates from own resources is that it's not the budgetary authority in the annual procedure that authorizes the revenue and the expenditure. The revenue and expenditure is decided in the act by which the money was assigned, which in this case is the Recovery Instrument Regulation under Article 122. So again, the Commission in a way has a big authorization on the basis of that regulation to use this assigned revenue for expenditure over a number of years, up to 2026. But of course, the budgetary authority also wants to know what's happening on an annual basis. And this was a bit the concern, which again is reflected in the IIA. We don't want to create a parallel shadow budget. The idea was to somehow align the process as much as possible with the annual budget. So the way they've done this, it's in point 44 of the IIA, is that when the Commission presents its draft annual budget based on own resources, the regular budget, it annexes to its proposal an annex on NGEU and specifying where the proceeds of borrowing will be assigned, on which budget line for this year, how much are we putting on each budget line. And this way the budgetary authority can see which budget lines are receiving the proceeds of borrowing for that year, and that might even impact their decision on how much they would put on that budget line from the ordinary budget. So then when the budget is adopted, the European Parliament and the Council include this annex as part of the formal budget. So for the budget for 2021, which should be published in the official journal fairly soon, if it hasn't been already, you can see this annex to the budget. Then turning to the RRF. Here, of course, the Parliament was co-legislator and had much more influence on the contents, in particular as regards the priorities and the criteria. With regard to accountability, we have Article 25, which concerns transparency and which says that all the documents that the Commission gives to the Council should also be presented to the Parliament, if necessary, under conditions of confidentiality. Also, we have Article 26, which provides for the recovery and resilience dialogue. So every 2 months, there should be a dialogue between the Commission and the Parliament. And this dialogue, it's up and running. They're public meetings, always quite interesting. The Parliament's Research Service, I see Magdalena Zapala is in the audience, produces very nice briefing notes around this, as does the Parliament's Economic Governance Unit. And within the Parliament, to implement these transparency elements and these elements of accountability, a Recovery and Resilience Working Group has been set up, and this is consisting of 27 MEPs, which has its own work programme and which meets fairly regularly. They're quite active, and these meetings prepare the dialogue with the Commission, and also they are the basis for sometimes for parliamentary resolutions. Another small point that's of interest is the discharge. Parliament has discharge powers, and the external assigned revenue falls within the scope of the discharge procedure. But the RRF does present some challenges from the point of view of discharge, because the discharge is based primarily on the report of the Court of Auditors. Now, auditing the RRF is a challenge because normally the methodology used by the Court of Auditors for auditing is based on eligible costs. So for structural funds, we have costs and you can check back where the costs were spent. In the RRF, you have milestones and targets. So it might be like reform the judicial system or reform the tax system. There isn't necessarily a receipt of costs that you can trace back. So this is a very interesting discussion that's going on in the Court of Auditors about what methodology should they apply to audit the RRF. And that in turn is posing issues here in the Parliament as to how the next discharge procedure should work, because again, it's not the classical template. Finally, on national parliaments, I think Amy already touched on this, that national parliament, the European Parliamentary Week is coming up when parliamentarians from the national parliament and the European Parliament will come together. And for the 14th and 15th of March, the two main themes on the agenda are NGEU and own resources. So both issues that are of interest to parliaments at both levels. Of course, really, when we talk about control and risks with the RRF, really the risks are primarily in the member states. And so this is why the regulation lays down very strict obligations on the member states as regards control and structures. But also it's why it's important that national parliaments also have a role and oversee their national plans. And many of them, of course, were involved in drawing up those plans. As a final point, I would just mention the judgments of last week in the rule of law conditionality cases. Just to mention, they have many, many interesting paragraphs, but one is paragraph 129 of the Hungarian case, and I think you'll find the content somewhere in the Polish case too, which talks about the union budget as one of the principal instruments for giving practical effect in the union's policies and activities to the principle of solidarity. And then in the next sentence, it says the implementation of that principle through the union budget is based on mutual trust between the member states in the responsible use of the common resources included in that budget, which would include NGEU. So I think we have interesting concepts introduced here, the budget as an instrument of solidarity and based on mutual trust, which of course is something we know more from free movement of goods or the European arrest warrant, where you have mutual recognition. But here the court introduces the concept of mutual trust in the context of the budget. And I think it's interesting. This also, I think, for the relationship between national and European parliaments, I think national parliaments have to see this is not just implementing a national plan. There is a European dimension. What happens in each member state is of relevance to the other member state. I think the message the court is sending here is, okay, we have solidarity, but equally solidarity requires responsibility and this mutual trust in each other's systems. So there, I think there are many issues to be developed, many challenges ahead. And I think this proves again why Rebuild is a perfectly timed project. And Federico and the team, I wish you all the best, and I hand back to Karine.
Thank you very much, Richard, for this very thought-provoking presentation, which is interinstitutional dynamics. Amy Verdun pointed out that the compass was going towards the Council while with the European and the European Council, which means ACA, the member states, with the European semester. Now you show how if we can anchor the recovery plan to the NGEU, to the RRF, then we might go back to the umbrella of what we know as far as institutional balance and recalibrate the institutional balance through this way. However, one can wonder indeed what would be the link between what the Council is deciding and the two councils are deciding, and how it will impact on how well member states will implement these measures, and vice versa. If member states do not implement them correctly, what will happen to the whole system, given the importance of the Council? But now we will have a view from someone who knows very well the position of the Commission. Julio, the floor is yours.
I don't know if I know very well the position of the Commission. I know very well my position, and I am talking here on a purely personal capacity and as an academic. So don't take my words for the Commission's position, which is a complex matter. The position of an institution is the result of lots of interactions, and I'm not here talking for the Commission, nor am I, entitled to do so. The new generation plan, I think, and I'm talking only on the basis of public information. I'm not using any documents that I have on my official capacity. The new generation plan, I think, is one of the few things, the few good things that has happened in the Union in the past 2 decades. And there are not many on high politics to compare it with. The Union has been going through a very hard times. Crisis pile upon crisis. One is not closed and the next is already there, even today. And they are not salutary crises. They put in question the very essence of the European Union. There is some action, but sometimes it's slow, not always robust. And there is a sense of fragility, I think, of muddling through the crisis. Yeah, and this is undermining the European Union. In parallel, I think one perceives, at least I perceive, a gradual mutation of the Union system, with a strengthening of the intergovernmental elements of the system and a marginalization, or at least a framing, of the core of the Union, which used to be the community method, correctly understood. In the areas where this shift takes place, the scope of policy is generally reduced towards the common minimum denominator, if there is one, because sometimes there is nothing in terms of common denominator. This development, of course, predates the new generation project. We lose sight of a very simple idea, which is the following: that process determines results and not the other way around. This is probably a consequence of the insistence on results over process that we hear from the intergovernmental camp. Of course, this becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when an egg is finally pawned. You don't have another egg to compare it with. So by definition, this is the best egg in the best of all the worlds possible. At present, I think the Union's constitutional framework can no longer be taken as a given. This may be unhealthy, but it's the way it is. In a stable system, you know in advance who does what and how. In the current Union, this is unclear when we enter the realm of high politics. I think the negotiation of the new generation instrument was not only about policy content, it was also about institutional and legal design. The discussion took place against the treaty rules and the case law, but all these things are open to interpretation, of course. Many of the law on these issues actually is not litigated. It is done between the institutions and their legal services. It's law outside the courts. Here we may have a preliminary reference, maybe from the German Constitutional Court, but Otherwise, these issues will not go to the Union Court. What we have by way of measures is in March 2020, so very quickly, a relaxation of state aid rules and the Stability Pact. Of course, the states had, we know that, very different fiscal positions. And we know that in 2020, 56% of the aid was granted by Germany, the aid authorized by the Commission. And this cannot not have an impact on the competitive situation of the member states. All these decisions of flexibility were adopted very quickly and very flexibly without formal acts, actually. Also very quickly and robustly, the ECB reacted in March 2020 with the PEPP. On the positive side of union policy, we have in the beginning only modest proposals and actions. The SURE regulation with 100 billion euro, all used and all channeled through the union budget. The pandemic credit line of the ESM, not used. And this was all perceived as insufficient. Later, the proposal for the new generation plan began to take shape and was adopted and approved. The new generation, which I would resist to qualify as foreign aid, this is the union helping the union, is composed of 3 blocks, and each of them has its own procedure. And this is what I want to talk about. The first, which is the essential one, is the amendment of the own resources decision. Without this, all the elements of the package would be dead letter. They would not have any impact. This is the basic financing element of the whole plan. And this instrument has the most rigid procedure, unanimity in the Council, after consultation of the Parliament, and then approval in all the member states. It comes. The other instruments are flexible. 122 of the Treaty on the Functioning allows the Council to act by qualified majority. And the programs were, I think, most of them, if not all of them, maybe all of them, under the ordinary legislative procedure. The timeline was for NGEU 1 year, a bit more than 1 year. From May 2020, first proposals, to the first payment in June 2021. Sure, I have to say it was a bit faster. It took 6 months, all in all, to activate it. This was an inextricable package, and I think there is a tension between the decision-making methods. Since this all was negotiated together at the same time, the most demanding method, that of the own resources decision, de facto in here, process determined results. We have large amounts, they are not symbolic, I'm not going to say that, and they involve a degree of redistribution. And it's all done within the union framework, unlike the ESM. And it's a break, I think a healthy break, with the reactions to the Euro crisis. However, the flight from union law was perhaps not needed, because the amendment of the own resources decision provided the states with a similar level of control. The ORD here takes the place of your usual EGA, I think. At the same time, if we hear the economists, they will tell us that the plan was macroeconomically modest, and that the transfers or redistribution was modest as well, and limited. The net transfers, I would say, only correct in part the competitive distortions due to national aid, which varies from member state to member state. I would like to ask whether this plan really reflects a genuine spirit of solidarity, or rather helping others insofar as it's useful for oneself. And I would like to ask whether unanimity can produce genuine solidarity in the proper sense, if the states really are only looking for the ground of intersection of their national interests. These are questions that I ask. This setup, by the way, also had side effects for the conditionality regulation that people have talked about already. But we would have had them in any case, because in parallel we had the MFF regulation negotiations, also under unanimity. Yeah, so the member states in question would have also had the possibility of blocking the MFF regulation. One just wonders whether the regulation should have been part of the MFF package. In view of these elements, the questions I ask are, is the NGEU a big leap forward? Is this mixture of different decision-making logics a cause for legal concern? Was another process possible? Some people think that this complex decision-making was unavoidable in view of the extreme rigidity of the Union's budgetary rules. It's not rules and events, I think, as Midelar says. I think it's rather regulation and expenditure. That's where the Union system enters into rigidities. I would like to suggest that while the solutions that were followed were lawful, and clearly so, this ceiling should be in the ORD, is not in the treaties. And I would like to underline this. The ORD is only a decision about the categories of own resources. Actually, the detail has to be in a much more flexible implementing measure adopted by the Council with the Parliament's consent by qualified majority voting. In practice, the ORD provides for limited genuine own resources. For the most part, it includes contributions from the member states linked to GNI and limits to them. I think this ceiling in the ORD fits a bit oddly with the rest of Article 311 of the TFEU, which seems to suggest that policies come first and resources then should be tantamount to the policy decisions. This is clear in the text. The Union shall provide itself with the means necessary to attain its objectives and carry through its policies. So policies first, means second. However, the ceiling becomes the master and limits the policies. And this thwarts, I think, the Union's budgetary autonomy, its adaptability, and its capacity to respond to emergencies. The Treaty of Lisbon introduced the ceilings in the MFF regulation. This is in Article 312 of the Treaty on the Functioning. This is also rigid. It involves a unanimous Council decision and the Parliament's consent, but is less burdensome than the ORD. The budgetary power and the legislative power for expenditure are therefore constrained by the ORD and the MFF. But these decisions normally occur at different times, and there is no contamination between procedures. Yeah, the headroom, which is very low and doesn't allow the Union sometimes sufficient space to respond to emergencies. That means that the power of the Council to provide financial assistance under Article 122 is conditional upon the availability and extent of this headroom, and that was justified the need to amend the ORD to raise the ceiling to allow for the borrowing without compressing the normal budget. The problem in this case, of course, is the simultaneity of the financing and the regulatory decisions. De facto, as I said before, then everything will be discussed under unanimity. The most exacting procedure absorbs the other de facto, if not de jure. And the community method is devoted to a fine-tuning of the instruments. This could have been resolved by creating a sequence. First the ORD, then the URI, and then afterwards the programs. But there was no time for that. We could not have a sequence. Another option maybe was the SURE model. Instead of amending the ORD, to have guarantees from the member states. Amending the ORD was legally possible, but maybe not indispensable if the SURE solution could have provided assurances within the meaning of Article 310. This could have been a possibility to have, not to require guarantees from all the states, but from a minimum number of them based on the threshold of qualified majority. The program would only benefit the states providing the guarantees. This would have allowed to discuss and negotiate the program under the shadow of the vote and to escape this minimum common denominator. Now, would this have been legally possible? and politically expedient. This I leave you to think about. Another possibility to avoid blockages was enhanced cooperation. And that, I think it was legally possible, certainly complex, but legally possible. The final thoughts I have is on the institutional balance as possibly affected by the major role that the European Council played in the process. Bruno De Witte, who I see among the audience or was there, has said that this was respected. If each of the acts was adopted with the correct legal basis and following the normal treaty procedure, in spite of what he calls some institutional anomalies in brackets. I think this is a mostly formal conception of the principle of the institutional balance. In my view, the principle also has a substantive content that should guide institutional practice beyond litigation. Now, the fact that the conclusions were not final and some fine-tuning was allowed from the other institutions is, I think, little comfort. The European Council's conclusions were extremely detailed and had binding legal languages with 87 occurrences of the word shall. Many people think that since the ORD and the MFF regulation are anyway adopted by the unanimity in the Council, this doesn't really matter. But I think a common position of such detail in the European Council has a greater impact on the other institutions than unanimity position in the Council. I think, all in all, the European Council could have and maybe should have played its role with a lighter touch. Another word on the emergency brake role for the European Council. We know now that this does not change the legal situation. The court some days ago pronounced itself on the emergency brake in the conditionality regulation, but this creates the risk of living in two worlds, one of law, increasingly formal, and another of possibly deviant political practices. If the European Council goes beyond its role, and this is agreed by all the member states, it will not be challenged. Arguing that the acts are not binding is a weak defense of the system because they will have a clear impact. And a practice that is at variance with the law does not become institutionally correct simply because it's just a practice. In view of these reflections, and this is my last thought, I am rather skeptical about presenting the New Generation project as a constitutional sea change for the Union, even if it is very significant in terms of substantive policy, don't get me wrong. But in institutional or structural terms, what it does is confirm the intergovernmental tendencies of the Union and the predominant role of the European Council to the detriment of the community method. A European Council, by the way, that is presented as the emergency decision maker, but that, in view of its composition, ethos, and methods, seems ill-suited for that role. Financially, I think the New Generation project stresses the rigidities of the Union's financial constitution, its lack of autonomy in view of the absence of significant genuine own resources, and its almost complete dependency towards the GNI resource. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julio, for your thoughts on the topic. It's quite interesting that it seems like you and Richard are coming into the same direction. In the meantime, would you have, or Michael, or even Federico, or the audience, would you have some reactions to what has been said by Julio? Do you share his concerns? Because I know that in an article you published for the European Law Journal, you talked about the budget and the RF, etc., as a kind of Hamiltonian moment. So it would be a positive constitutional momentum, while Julio is actually implying that, yes, it might be a constitutional momentum, but we don't know if it will really be a positive one. And actually, when he's referring to policies first, and then, let's say, budget rules and the unanimity, community method, and so on and so forth, one can wonder whether this autonomy of the budgeted rules shouldn't be preserved so that yes, policies come first, but we have to make sure that we abide by the community rules somehow. Would you have some reaction, Richard?
He questions the own resources ceiling, and there I would have, this is something we've often considered in the Parliament's legal service. There is only one ceiling foreseen in the treaties, which is the MFF ceiling under Article 3112, which is a ceiling on expenditure. So if this ceiling on revenue turns de facto into a ceiling on expenditure, do we have a legal problem? It's an interesting question. I don't think this own resources decision was the one where the Parliament was ever going to contest it, because it was the basis for the recovery plan. But yeah, that's quite an interesting legal question.
Jan Cooper, okay.
I have a question for Richard Crowe. I'm very, very interested in the question about the parliamentary oversight of the NGEU budgetary process. And I was very interested that you mentioned the European Parliamentary Week, which is a very interesting, institution. And as you know, it grew out of the of Article 13 of the Fiscal Compact. That the idea that the European semester and and other institutions that are similarly involved national parliaments should be involved in the oversight of how the fiscal compact was implemented, and I'm wondering whether there should be a more formal role for national parliaments in the oversight of NGEU. The thing about the European Parliamentary Week is it is basically just an informal institution. It's not based in the treaty or anything like that. And while it gives a role for national parliaments, but I think national parliamentarians often get the feeling that they take a back seat to the European Parliament. The European Parliament just wants to be seen to be consulting with national parliament before going ahead and speaking but they see themselves, the European Parliament sees themselves as the main parliamentary interlocutor with EU level institutions.
Richard, would you like to answer? And
yeah, I'll be very brief because I see Julio is back. But yes, it's really the question going back to the convention and the Lisbon Treaty. How do you bring national parliaments into the process? And I think now it's really becoming serious. It's not just a decoration, but there are serious interests, as I said, mutual trust, that there are serious interests of national parliaments seeing what other national parliaments are doing and discussing together what's going on. In the European semester, of course, it's about economic coordination for which they are responsible. But yeah, in the RRF, I think it's an open discussion.
Do we have any questions? Because we're going to wrap up soon. We would like to also engage with the audience. Do people have comments or questions?
I do have a comment in case, but I think Gavin is also raising his hand.
Yes, Gavin, please.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to ask Richard if the European Parliament is happy with the role that it has been given in terms of the NGEU, or does it feel that it has been sidelined to a certain extent, because its role in the dialogue is a somewhat limited role, isn't it?
Yeah, it's again, I think, as Julio said earlier, to determine the position of an institution is a difficult thing. I think the Parliament in general was hugely supportive of the NGEU initiative and was very happy that it went ahead under the EU institutional framework. As regards its role, yes, I think in the RRF especially, there is a frustration with the procedure in the sense that the national plans are approved by the Council on a proposal from the Commission. And we see this also in the conditionality regulation. And increasingly we see this, that it's implementing acts adopted by the Council on a proposal from the Commission. And where then does the Parliament come into that process? And for example, we see that with the Polish recovery plan and the potential approval of that recovery plan. We've had plenary resolutions where the Parliament is politically sending the message don't approve this unless the whole judicial independence situation is sorted out. But in practical terms, if they go ahead, what can be done? So I think it's a mixture, and I think it's a mixture of being happy that this is going ahead, but at the same time trying to make everything as much as possible into the old traditional community method, which on the budgetary side, as I said, is not especially easy. We're improvising, as I said, in a way. But the practices, of course, can become law at a later stage. And maybe an interesting example there is that during the negotiations, the Parliament negotiated a joint declaration with the Council saying that in future, whenever a proposal is made on the basis of Article 122, a procedure of budgetary scrutiny should take place, consisting of representatives of the Parliament and the Council. Now, this is nowhere provided for in the treaty. Under Article 122, the Parliament is only informed, but in future there will be this procedure of budgetary scrutiny. And just a couple of weeks ago, we actually had the first time of implementing it, because the Commission put forward a proposal to make this HERA, the emergency response body for pandemics, for health emergencies. And this was proposed on the basis of Article 122, and the Parliament immediately said, okay, now we want to activate this budgetary scrutiny procedure. And 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting of the representatives of the Parliament and the Council to scrutinise this proposal on the basis of 122. So there it's a case of doing something in practice, and maybe then at the next treaty revision, when Article 122 is revised, we can codify this. So I think Parliament is now looking at where can it push itself in a way where the treaties don't allow it. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. I see that Federico is raising his hands. Do we have other questions, please? We're about to conclude, so if you have any questions or comments that you would like to make, now is the time. Federico?
The question I had for both Julio and Richard is admittedly a technical legal one, and I'd be interested in sort of having your views on the use of Article 122 for the EU recovery instrument, and perhaps to hear from you if you can share more about the conversation at legal level on that specific on the use of the EURI. As a piece of the puzzle for Next Generation EU, because to some extent, I mean, it's very interesting that the detailed bit is the Recovery and Resilience Facility regulation based on Article 175, so cohesion policy, but still we had to use Article 122. I mean, the choice was made to use Article 122 to adopt a super short regulation, which simply, I think, at least to me, signals that in the views of the state, NGEU is as a temporary one-off emergency measure. But I wonder, is that really necessary? Could Next Generation EU legally stand without Article 122? And I think Bruno De Witte, Julio, you were mentioning it in his analysis on common market law review. He basically dismisses the importance of that provision. But I'd be curious to have your thoughts on this, because I think this is very important in the big discussion that is due to come, whether we can make Next Generation EU permanent rather than temporary.
Thank you, Federico. We will try to take at the same time Carlo Garbarino question, and then we will wrap up. Carlo?
Yes, can you hear me? Okay, very quick question. Basically, conditionality and democratic control overlap. So I would like to have a reaction from Richard and Julio, possibly, if you have time on that, because basically conditionality makes possible for the Commission to reject proposals, projects from member states without the intervention of their parliaments or without any control at the European level. So, you know, these two things combined are crucial. And I would like just to have a very quick reaction on that. Thank you.
I can very briefly start. Maybe Richard, or do you want to start before my connection drops?
Maybe I'll start. I'll start quickly, because I would even put a point to Julio as a follow-up. But Yeah, so on the conditionality, I think this is, as I said, there are two sides of the same coin, the solidarity and the conditionality. And in fact, the Parliament, as co-author of the RRF, was very much in favour of giving the Commission these powers of suspending and so on, if there's any doubt about the conditions being respected. On the legal basis, yeah, it's a very interesting question, Federico. I think in the Parliament, the question even arose, did we need the own resources decision for the borrowing? Could it all have been done on the basis of Article 122? Now, as for doing it all on the basis of Article 175, I don't know. On the budgetary side, borrowing using all this external assigned revenue, it is quite exceptional. But here I think I'll hand over to Julio.
But you had a question for me, you forgot.
No, the question was just to add could it have been done only on 122 without the own resources decision?
Okay, I see. No, I think the 122 regulation is in policy terms the centerpiece of the operation, not in financial terms. This is what justifies the exceptionality, not following normal procedures, the emergency and one-off nature of the operation. Actually, what you need to think about as an academic is what was the divide between the things that were put in the ORD and the things that were put in the 122 regulation, because there was a margin there. And I think the Council Legal Service, in the opinion it issued, it speaks about this margin. Yeah, maybe more things could have gone into the 122 regulation or more into the ORD. Since the ORD is almost an act of primary law, you have a margin there to decide to put things in it and not in the 122 regulation. But the 122 regulation remains, I think, essential to justify this intervention, which I think rules out by its very nature the possibility of having this as a permanent fixture in EU finances. At least that's the way we see it institutionally. On the conditionality, I think this is a legal conditionality. It's decided by the Union legislature, which has democratic legitimacy for the Union, and then it's applied by the institutions through administrative procedures, and it's subject to judicial review by the court. So I think it's perfectly legitimate and covered by democratic legitimacy on the Union level. Thank you.
Thank you, all panelists and the participants, for your participation and contributions. I guess this session could have been called the NGEU, and its governance system, an exceptional instrument with pros and cons. We will see about that. The discussions will continue tomorrow, and then to introduce the rest of the conference, I will give the floor to Federico. Federico, you have the concluding words. Thank you very much to all of you for your contributions and inputs today.
And thank you very much to you, Karine, for chairing so wonderfully this panel. I want to echo your words and thank warmly the four speakers for this panel, Amy Verdun, Michael Breen, Richard Crowe, and Julio Baquero Cruz.